So we might just give 30 seconds for people to get in and get settled, and then we'll kick off. All right, so thanks everyone for joining the discussion tonight. This is a panel on innovative financing and legal models for housing, and this is part of the New Economy Network Australia and Co-Housing Australia week of discussions on housing. So thanks to NENA and Co-Housing Australia for hosting, especially Michelle and Elena. Just a housekeeping thing, of course, we're on Zoom. Everyone just stay on mute when you're not speaking. We've got chat if you've got questions. I think we'll mainly be having discussion among the panel, but if there's questions there or comments that you want to make, there's the chat bar. So before we kick off, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners. Of course, I'm coming in from Gadigal land, so I acknowledge the Gadigal of the Aurora Nation, who are the custodians of the land I'm calling in from, but also whatever land you're coming in from, we acknowledge the nations there as well. So, and pay respects to elders past and present. So also I work for the cooperative sector, and I'll just give a brief note on that, but acknowledge all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cooperatives around Australia as well. So, as I said, I work for the peak body for cooperatives, the Business Council of Co-ops and Mutuals. I'm the policy advisor there. And I wanted to give one little plug for us that's nothing to do with housing, is that we have a program at the moment called Co-op Farming. And through that, we funded a documentary that is screening on ABC about farming co-ops. We're really excited about it. It'll be on 15th of June at 9:30 on ABC, and it will also be on iView after that. So just a little plug from me. But I'll now give just a brief introduction to our speakers, panelists this evening. We're going to speak to this topic of innovative financing and legal models for housing. Firstly, we'll have Karen Deegan, who's a member of Newcoh, which is Newcastle's first collaborative living initiative. Then we'll have Tim Riley, who's the founder and development director at Property Collectives. Property Collectives seeks to support people who want to take control of their housing options and create high quality inner city living at cost. And then we'll have Colin Long, who is a member and I believe director, correct me if I'm wrong, Colin, at Earthwork, amongst other things. Earthwork is a cooperative that brings together unionists, environmentalists, and others who want to tackle pressing social and environmental challenges, and it has a focus on creating worker cooperatives and creating a network of worker co-ops, but also is looking at housing. And finally, we will have Louise Crabtree-Hayes, who is Associate Professor at the Institute of Society and Culture at the University of Western Sydney. And Louise is an expert in community land trusts and housing cooperatives. So I'll hand over now to Karen to give her presentation. We've got 15 minutes each for the presentations and then Q&A.
Thank you, Anthony. I just wanted to specifically pay my respects to the specific lands that I'm standing on tonight, which is the Awabakal and Warramai people. And I pay my true respects to their elders, past, present, and future. I'll pull up my slides to make it all a bit prettier. Can everybody see that? Yep, working. Okay, so good evening.
I don't think we can see.
Oh, off and running and not working. Let's try that again. Is that better?
That's better.
Yes, you can see what I'm seeing. Fantastic. Okay, so good evening. And I want to reiterate what Anthony said and say a big thank you to NENA and Co-Housing Australia for all the time and energy put into bringing this together. I've already gotten so much out of the sessions I've attended and looking forward to the remaining two, especially tomorrow mornings. My name is Karen Deegan. As I said, tonight am going to represent Newcoh. And through this presentation, I want to describe not only the legal and financial model that we are creating, but also how we've arrived at it, because it's not the most obvious answer for a co-housing group, the answer that we've created for ourselves. So I am a member of Newcoh, and it has a really big focus on one particular problem, and that problem is social isolation. So as much as Newcoh is looking to achieve many things, at the heart of the reason why over 35 people have come together over a common vision is this very unusual thing about being conditioned to not know our neighbours. I believe that this is very clear in Australia, but maybe not so necessarily true in other cultures and other parts of the world. This is really symbolic of what I think we, the members of Newcoh are afraid of, that we will end up at. And this is an image that we use a lot to inspire ourselves. There's so much wrong with what this image symbolises. And it's really the sort of single objective that brings all of our members together. We have many other objectives, and I'll go through them a little bit later in the presentation, but this is, you know, our symbol of success. If we end up not living like this in 10 years' time, then we know we've made it. First, let me just describe what Newcoh is. Newcoh is just short for Newcastle Co-Housing. We weren't very creative in our self-naming. We're a group of, usually we hover around the 35 member mark. I think these slides are a bit old now, and we're at the 45 member mark at the moment. And we're looking to create a co-housing project in Newcastle specifically. The aim of the game is to end up with about 28 to 34 households in total. And at the moment, we're at the site purchase stage. So this is definitely far from over, and we still have a lot of battles to win to get there. The place where Newcoh started was really about articulating the problems that we collectively want to overcome with the co-housing project we want to live in. And a changing climate was a really big part of that, and not just that, how to live with more weather shocks and hotter summers and colder winters, but also we wanted to absolutely reduce our impact on climate change collectively and individually. We are acutely aware as a group of people of housing inequality. A good majority of the people in Newcoh are having trouble accessing housing on their own, and we just can't believe that that's even a reality for people in Australia. So we want to, through the process of creating the Newcoh project, really address housing inequality in a way that we hope is replicable. As I talked about earlier, social isolation is our biggest driver. And I think what we'd also really like to draw people's attention to is that social isolation more and more has been researched, and its bedmate, loneliness, and any kind of chronic sense of living with loneliness is now easily connected to a whole lot of knock-on physical and mental health issues. We kind of have all shared many stories between the members about the poor quality of housing that we currently live in, especially for the renters in our membership. And as winter is drawing near, especially today, and how desperately uncomfortable people are just living inside their homes in a country where the climate isn't that extreme is something that we're all really clear that we want to address. We have to increase the quality of how we build our homes and how we operate them. And another part that we came to later as a group is housing diversity. There are a lot of members in Newcoh who just can't find appropriate housing, and that's everything, a range of issues. So we've got people living with various physical abilities, someone who is blind, someone who is living in a wheelchair and they don't have adequate housing. We have quite a number of single person households and they can't find affordable, appropriate housing for themselves, as well as the simple problem of people who want to live close to amenities. So they're probably looking at apartments, but they can't live with their pets, you know. So simple things like that we really want to address in the model that we create under Newcoh. So we flipped all of those and we came up with our 10 objectives. And these are all really important to how then we arrived at our model. We want to be resident-led, so we want to be highly involved in the design process so that we can be educated, make the best decisions to get the greatest value out of our budget. We want to make sure that the design specifications and all the bolt-on technologies in our project help us to live with a lot less carbon impact. Shared property management to people outside of the co-housing space might sound a little bit interesting, but we are really clear, and it's not the easiest thing to implement, is how we ensure that every resident, regardless of ownership status, is equally involved in the property management once we're living there. And the reason why we want that is we believe that sharing the looking after and the custodianship of our shared spaces and our building will keep us in a working relationship, will ensure that we continuously improve in ways where we make decisions together and communicate with each other. And it ensures that everyone who's living there has a fair voice in what happens in their backyard. We're really clear that we want to be multi-generational. We feel like that is how we've evolved to live. We weren't supposed to live with just, you know, one other person or two or three other people in our households. We want to have access to older people and younger people than us. We want to make sure we have mixed tenure, so ownership, rental, and the other types of tenure within the model. Disability inclusive in design, designed to facilitate interaction between the neighbours. We want a various amount of shared spaces so that we can meet together in different forms and in different numbers of people. Less car dependence, so the location of this is highly important, and also how we create bike parking facilities, as well as an ability to share car ownership and usage. And we want to make sure, which is objective 10, that all of this isn't in some sort of gated community. We want to have these this amenity, these outdoor and indoor spaces on common that are commonly shared, available to people outside of where we live. So this is kind of how we think those objectives meet the problems that we articulated earlier. And we're working, there's a lot of homework behind all of these strategies, but there's one that is particularly tricky for all of us to achieve, which is housing inequality. I just wanted to mention this because it is another part of Newcoh's legal and financial model, is that we're working with some sympathetic lenders at the moment, or mortgage lenders, and we've created something called the Better Together mortgages, where we have a good portion of our membership are people who are, most of them are single older women who are kind of falling between the cracks. They have money, they have cash in the bank, but it's not enough to purchase a home. But it puts them in the position where they're not eligible for social housing, and very little other kind of government subsidised living to assist them to get into a quality and safe home. So together with, we've got two sympathetic lenders on board, we believe that we can create a mortgage for people who have the right amount of equity and they just need to borrow just that little bit more. And we are offering these mortgages to people who are on government benefits, so either the age pension or the disability pension. The other part to it is we have been courting community housing providers for over 5 years now, and we've gotten close now with one community housing provider, and we're looking for them to take out some head leases on a portion of the apartments so that we can offer some at social housing rates. So getting to the actual legal and financial model for the whole of the project. I just wanted to start here just by describing how we came at our model. So us, the co-housing group, has strengths and weaknesses. We're a group of, and it does range between 28 to 34, and there's reasons for those two numbers. We're really clear about our design brief now. We're working on that and we continue to work on that, but we know what we want. We all have our individual budgets sorted and we've done our homework, and then therefore we have our collective budget. We are a legal entity and registered already, and we have a really great formalised decision-making process, and we're practiced at it. So, and what that means is as a group of over 35 adults, we can take on complicated decisions and make a single answer to that in a timely manner. And I think that's really important when we go into what this model actually is. Our weaknesses is we're not property developers. We don't know how to site search. We need a site that's at least 3,500 square metres, and we want that in a high amenity area. That's a really big block of land to find anywhere these days. We don't have the time as a group to run a project like that. And what's more of a stop to any of this process is that collectively, even between the 30 odd people, we can't come up with the nearly $400,000 in cash or equity needed to start and finish this property development process. And even if we did, we have a total inability to lend for construction. And that's, due to inexperience, we don't have the cash flow, we don't have any significant security to court that finance. So there was no way. We kind of came to this realisation about two and a half years in as a group. And we nearly fell over once we came to the hard facts. But then we thought, what about property developers? Or in our actual case, we're working with a construction company. So what are they good at? They're good at being a property developer. They're great at finding sites. They're great at working out what to pay for those sites. They are good at negotiating with council, and they're also obviously have to be good at predicting and managing costs to build the desired outcome. What they're weaker at, and it's nothing to do with property developers, it's just the nature of the game, is that it's an extremely speculative process. They don't know what they decide to build will be bought. It's very difficult for them to deliver any kind of environmental or social innovation because there's not enough built examples for them to point at to then say, hey, if we build this, people will buy it at that price, therefore can you lend me the money to build it? And in Newcastle, we've got a sort of bit of a perfect storm here where apartment prices are actually decreasing, and that's mainly because of oversupply, but for obviously a whole lot of other reasons. So what happens when you bring those two groups together? All of a sudden, all those issues around for the co-housing group, which we ended up sort of calling ourselves when we talk to property developers, is we're a buyers group. So we can be really clear about what we want and how much we're going to pay for it. And obviously the property developers are really good at all the site search and all the other parts to property development. So we believe that that's been a good match. And from the discussions we've had with property developers, we've gotten a big yes. This is the actual chronological steps to it. But in essence, what we're doing is at site purchase, we provide a list of suburbs and proximity characteristics. The developer puts up some sites for consideration. Once design gets going, the co-housing group puts a 5% deposit into a developer's trust account. And in return for that, the property developer has to provide us with very meaningful facilitation and customisation of the design and specification. Once it's approved at council, we pay a further 5% of the price into the developer's trust account. The developer keeps doing what the developer does. Then at construction, we're involved in any design or specification changes. Again, the developer's just managing the construction process. And at sales and move-in, once they all become separate strata titles, the individuals pay the outstanding amount and we allow the release of those 10% funds that's in the trust account to the developer, and then the developer hands over the property titles. Bit of a whirlwind explanation of how we're doing it. We believe it's a win-win, and we hope that this is something that if we can kind of cross the T's and dot the I's, that we can make available to other co-housing groups. And then the idea is to live like this, where we will know each other as neighbours. In fact, that will be more than neighbours, will be friends. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. We'll go straight into the next presentation. We started a couple minutes late, so we'll keep cracking along to allow time for that Q&A at the end. But thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, unmuted myself. My name's Tim Riley and I'm the founder of Property Collectives. Property Collectives is a citizen-led housing model, and its real aim is around building homes at cost for the members of each collective. We've been around for a bit over 10 years now, and we started out with a model which was a deliberative development model around the joint venture structure. But in recent years, we've sort of expanded things beyond just the model itself. So we've now incorporated an advisory service, which is really around project support and delivery. And then an impact arm, which is around capital advisory and investment management. And so those three different parts of the business, I suppose, are working together to try and enable more impactful projects to be delivered. In terms of those three words down the bottom, capability, capacity, and character, I put those words there because, as Karen kind of alluded to before, one of the biggest challenges with doing any development, let alone a development that's using an alternative model, is getting bank funding. And, you know, that's always the number one goal, because bank funding will always be the cheapest debt there is. And what we've learned over the last 10 years is that the way banks look at any developer is that they assess the 3 C's, you know, capability, capacity, and character. And capability is really around your ability to deliver a project of the sort of scale that you're wanting to prosecute. Capacity is the financial capacity, and, you know, character is, you know, how you are as a person. Are you a person of good character? So they look at these projects through this lens, and, you know, if you're not ticking all of the boxes, then, you know, odds are that it's going to be difficult to get the funding. And I suppose we've been through that journey over the last 10 years, and now we've managed to build up capability in terms of the advisory service, capacity is inherent, I suppose, in the model. And each collective is a bit different, but we do work through a very detailed process to understand capacity. And character goes, I suppose, at the heart of each project, but then also the team of people that are going to deliver it. So from an advisory perspective, we're a group of individuals who have had varying degrees of experience in development. A lot of our team are sort of ex-tier 1 construction and development professionals who are now sort of gone out on their own. And we're banding together in really a best per project cooperative approach. The range of skills are quite cross-disciplinary. So everything from capital and debt markets, advisory through to feasibility analysis, acquisitions, development and project management, I suppose, is at the core of what we do. But over the last couple of years, we've definitely understood and sought new capability and new resourcing around design management and cost planning, which is really critical for these sorts of alternative approaches, particularly when you're getting community and citizens involved in the model. So that's a big focus of ours. And you'll see some other disciplines there: urban design, asset management. And the group now is providing a lot of advice to different clients under this model. So DELP, which is one of the departments here in Victoria, and Office of the Victorian Government Architect on a future homes program that they're running for infill projects in the middle suburbs. Villa Maria Catholic Homes, we're providing strategic advice and development management and PM services to them. Homes Victoria, we're involved in the big housing build with a project for social housing in Collingwood, and also working on a project in Preston for the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. So, so that's kind of the advisory stream. The model is really about turning fractional ownership into direct home ownership. And I suppose where it's quite a different model is that, similar to what Karen's done with Newcoh, we spend a lot of time getting a group of people together, a core collective that share a similar vision before we go looking for a piece of land. And then once we have that group together, we will go out and purchase a piece of land that suits their requirements, and then manage that development process through to completion, where the group will receive individual titles. So it is an ownership model to their dwellings, and that they receive those dwellings at cost, typically around 15% less than the market. That's what we aim for. And we've delivered, or are in the process of delivering, 9 collectives under this model, building 60 homes. People often ask us, so aren't you just Nightingale? And this slide sort of talks to how we're different, really. Along the main axis, you've got, I suppose, a lot of the different features of different models. So the scale, whether it's small or large, typology, whether you're focusing on townhouses or apartments, location, the model, whether it's an ownership model or a rental model, cost and price, whether it's a sort of a focused on the high end of the market or the low end of the market, the amount of capital that's involved for participants, whether it's a low capital option or a high, the level of risk, which is really critical. You know, does the risk sit with the developer or does it sit with the participant? And the degree of control that people have over their outcomes. So do you have, in a typical speculative model, you don't really have too much control over the end product, whereas in other models, you can have a higher degree of control. So sort of mapped out really where two of the more well-known, I suppose, models in Victoria sort of sit on that sort of axis, the assembled sort of rent-to-buy model and Nightingale. And our model sits really along that left axis. You know, we've been focusing on smaller projects, sort of around 6 to 10 dwellings. It's been mostly townhouses, mostly inner city. It is an ownership model. And I suppose because of where we've come from, the cost and the capital impost on members has been quite high. And that's because the model enables people to become the developer, you know, and so they're taking on that responsibility. So while, and that means from a funding perspective, they're having to put more equity in than a purchaser would, you know, buying off the plan and having a 10% deposit, or, you know, even an established property and maybe getting an 80% mortgage. We're borrowing at commercial rates, which means we need to put in more equity, albeit on a lower cost, because you're internalising those developer returns. The flip side of that is that you get your home at cost, but you also get a lot of control over the design outcome, because you're in control of the money, you're in control of the equity, so you're in control of the project. What we're moving to increasingly is a sort of an evolved model, which kind of splits the middle, and we're looking to partner with community housing providers to kind of bring and look at different locations, more suburban locations, different typologies, so increasingly more apartments, to try and I suppose scale the good bits to the model and make it more accessible to more people. So really, the model is trying to deliver better homes more affordably by enabling people to boost their buying power by acting collectively. And we do this by internalising developer returns, by not having to pay agent or marketing sales or marketing commissions, and also from the model being quite tax efficient. You know, if all the members are on board, when we settle on the land, we only pay stamp duty on the purchase of the land. Everybody has a beneficial ownership over that piece of the land. So when everybody gets their individual dwellings, it's not a stamp duty event. So there's no double stamps or anything like that. So it's quite a tax efficient structure, and there's savings, obviously, in that. The model is also very participatory, so it does give people more control over, you know, the location, the design, and the quality of their future homes. We use a plan of work which we've adopted from the Royal Institute of British Architects to kind of guide our process, and all the members of the group get to endorse decisions as we move through the 7 gates of the process. And this is a snapshot of the projects that we've put together under this model. So there's 9 across Melbourne. They're all sort of inner city focused, and they've all been between 6 to 10 dwellings. And the ones in Thornbury and Northcote that are greyed out are the ones that we've finished. We've about to finish the St Kilda one, and we've got 3 in build at the moment and two coming up for build. The impact side of the business was really launched because, you know, for a long time now, probably for the last 5 years, we've been trying to work out, well, how can we make the economic, social, and environmental benefits of this sort of model more inclusive? So Property Collective's impact is an investment platform that exists to enable more citizen-led and community-led housing projects in Australia. So it is an equity capital platform that is looking to put money into projects to enable them. And the sorts of projects that we're looking to support and develop is a replicable deliberative co-housing model, using the guts of our joint venture model as the bones of a co-housing model. We're targeting cost savings of 15% in projects of circa 15 to 40 homes. And we're wanting to enable more multi-generational and potentially seniors focused intentional communities. And to do that, we're looking at partnering with values aligned organisations. And from our perspective, it's really about, well, how do we take this model that we've created and really, I suppose, operating system to focus with partner organisations and enable these sorts of projects. On the finance, we're also looking at how can we financialise participation via shared equity positions in projects. To Karen's point before, a lot of people that are coming to us with a real intention to get involved in these projects are just not in a position to participate financially under sort of the traditional funding model. So we have to look at more creative ways to make that happen.
Just a minute or two to finish up.
Sure. So this is just a snapshot of our typical model and how it works. And, you know, the joint venture in the middle there, the SPV joint venture is the real key to the model, and control sits in that joint venture. Everybody who's part of the joint venture gets a vote on the management committee, and decisions are made by the management committee. I'll whip through this. This is our funding model. There's 3 stages. We borrow to purchase the land, we borrow to get construction underway, and those 2 stages are done collectively. And then all the individuals at the end get home loans, and they proportionally pay out the construction loan. The key barriers with the model really are costs. We still are delivering homes that are not truly affordable, I suppose. They're more affordable, but they're still quite expensive. Cash is an issue, so coming up with the 30-35% equity is an issue for a lot of people. Risk is also an issue with this sort of model because a lot of the banks require joint and several liability, and that's not for everybody. But we have forged relationships with some banks who offer several liability, which is good, and time. It does take a long time to do these projects. So our focus, I suppose, to enable us to get to this 2.0 stage is multidimensional. So from a finance perspective, particularly, we are exploring shared developer equity positions in the joint ventures to bring down that cost, that amount of equity that is required. We're also in the early stages, like Karen is as well, around a building group home loan type product, which will allow people to put in less equity to participate. And we're using options to try and secure projects and bring down the overall cost of the project and lighten the cash flow burden on members through using options to secure properties. And this is kind of how we see the model evolving with the introduction of property collectives impact, the introduction of using options to start building out a portfolio of properties for these sorts of projects, and also in partnership down the bottom with community housing providers who may also be participating under that joint venture structure for rental co-op, for shared equity positions, or to give members of a collective a bit of a helping hand to participate through a shared developer equity position. So yeah, in short, I suppose that's a bit of what we've been doing, and a bit of a roadmap of how we sort of see that this sort of model can sort of scale, I suppose, for want of a better term, to try and deliver more impact by building more resilient and diverse intentional communities.
Thanks very much, Tim. So next up, we've got Colin.
Thanks, Anthony. I do have a little PowerPoint, not as attractive by any means as the previous two speakers, but we'll run through it anyway. Thanks for the opportunity. As I said to some people earlier, I should just say I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land in Melbourne at the moment as well. There's a number of people who I think are much more qualified on housing issues than I am, and thank Elena and Louise in particular. They've been providing a lot of inspiration and knowledge that we've been learning from over the last 12 months or whatever it's been, that we've been trying to develop earthworker housing. I should also say from the outset that Earthworker, which I'll explain for those who don't know in a moment, we strongly support increased, I'm going to talk today about a cooperative housing model, but we strongly support increased investment in public housing and other forms of social housing provision, including other forms of cooperatives. We strongly believe that social, public and affordable housing should not just be a safety net form of housing. In fact, they should be used to provide real choice outside the existing private market options, a real choice for housing for all people, and a means to improve the level of affordability overall in Australia, which of course has one of the worst levels of housing unaffordability in the world, and we'd like to improve that. So what is Earthworker? For those who don't know, Earthworker is a cooperative network based in Victoria. We focused on providing practical and democratic responses to the challenges of climate change and economic inequality. We have a solar hot water factory in Morwell. We have a cleaning cooperative based in Melbourne, and we have an asylum seeker cooperative run by and for asylum seekers, providing employment opportunities and support for education running in Melbourne. And we also are currently building an energy services cooperative to go alongside a energy retailer that we operate as well, and owned by a number of trade unions and other organisations. As I said, we believe in democratic and participation in or control over economic activity, and we have a similar view towards housing, that and we think the cooperative model in particular provides members of cooperatives real control over their housing circumstances, and allows the collectivisation of resources to improve affordability and maximise provision of infrastructure, for example, solar power, and of amenity, for instance, shared facilities, and helps to develop a sense of community and wider social benefit. Earthworker housing has developed a number of goals that we think are particularly important. We wish to provide affordable housing for cooperative members. We don't claim to be providing social housing. We're not providing any housing at this stage. We're building our model. But we're not providing social housing. We're providing affordable housing. We're pretty much targeting key worker housing, we would say, for those workers who need to work close to the inner cities but cannot afford to live in inner city housing because it's become so expensive. So nurses, emergency services workers, even cleaners, various forms of employment that you find in the inner city, but where workers very much can't afford to live these days. We are very interested in improving housing security of housing tenure for cooperative members. Our bigger interest in energy and resource efficiency is completely engaged in this idea as well. So we want to deliver energy and resource efficient housing with a goal of zero emission housing. We want to demonstrate resource efficient and innovative housing construction techniques. So we are talking to housing prefabrication companies, which will deliver much more efficient housing and also cheaper. And we're very interested in demonstrating the benefits of cooperative models for the provision of high quality affordable housing, and exploring new models of financing social and affordable housing, which is of course what this session of the conference is about. We're also inspired by some of the great trade union housing cooperatives of New York City, of Canada, and of Europe. Some of you will be aware of those, but they're of a scale that we can only envy, and been very successful in many ways in pretty difficult housing markets such as New York for very long periods of time. So what we're proposing is a shared equity model. It's not such a common model in Australia. And members of the co-op, members and the cooperative that they are members of, share investment in the housing, as well as maintenance costs and shared facilities. Residents purchase a share in a development rather than an individual unit, and commit to resell their share at a price that is determined by a formula. In Australia, this is going to be best delivered with a limited equity, non-distributing housing cooperative, which might work like this, as shown on your screen. So cooperative members invest in fixed price cooperative shares to buy property. If there's additional finance required, it's secured by bank loan or via the issue of cooperative capital units. There's some legal requirements about that, but it's kind of a form of cooperative share that ensures that the cooperative can't come under control of investors or anything like that. The cooperative purchases properties for members. The cooperative charges members mandatory member subscription fees for ongoing costs such as maintenance, a bit similar to owners corp fees. Upfront share prices and subsequent increases in these are restricted by a legal mechanism that the cooperative would decide upon. And when members leave, if they leave the cooperative, including via the means of death, their cooperative share capital is returned to the cooperative, and a new member buys into the cooperative by purchasing shares. So cooperative shares operate differently to shares on the stock market. So they're fixed in value, they're refundable, and in a non-distributing cooperative, which is what we advocate, they don't offer dividends. And crucially, as I said before, about making sure investors don't get control of their cooperative, irrespective of shareholding, all members of cooperative are entitled to only one vote. Non-distributing, so the non-distributing cooperative model ensures that the cooperative can't be sold off to or demutualized to someone else at some stage. Rather similar, I think, to the community land trust model, which Louise is an expert in. Our approach means the cooperative owns the land and buildings, and buying the cooperative shares is the financial mechanism for members to gain exclusive use of a co-op owned home and shared use of any common property. We are currently working on developing the model. We are working with private sector development partners to who will provide the development framework. And what we're essentially they are looking at reasonably large sites. When I say large, hundreds of housing units. We're not talking about apartments. We're talking about standalone houses. And out of private development partners are looking at reasonably large sites, of which they will provide a percentage to the cooperative to own and manage under this limited equity cooperative model. And I think I'll leave it there, and a little bit under my 15 minutes, which gives you a bit of time to catch up, Anthony. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin. Very cooperative of you to do that. Thank you. So next we will go to Louise.
Thanks, Anthony. So last in our conga line of presentations, I will bring up my PowerPoint, but also once coming up, I just want to acknowledge lands that I'm speaking from tonight, which are the Gadigal lands, the Eora Nation, and just want to acknowledge others past and present, and extraordinary care and wisdom and stewardship that has been enacted for millennia on this continent. So for those of you who were tuned in earlier in the week, we talked a bit about property, and words came up like decommodification and stewardship and things. So I'm going to kind of drill down a bit on those and talk about community land trusts, which was my remit. And I just want to thank Michelle and Eleanor for setting up such an awesome week of events. And it really is great to be here with everyone who's speaking tonight and to hear about the reassuring expansion of the diversity of the Australian housing sector. It's slow going, but really good to see us here. So what I'm going to talk about is this idea of stewardship, and then give some examples. So we're thinking about what community land trusts are and this role of stewardship. They have a sort of clear but broad definition, which is that they operate as non-profit entities holding title to property to provide perpetual affordability and community benefits. So it's clear, but it's nicely broad. And what it means is each CLT gets to say, well, what do we think perpetual affordability looks like? What do we think community benefit looks like? So it's sort of that deliberative element coming through. And then that also means this incredible diversity in the programs and the housing that they develop. So underpinning all of that, whether it's rental or ownership or cooperative housing or what have you, is very much this ethic of stewarding these decommodified homes and also non-housing developments such as parks, community gardens, community facilities. Is this idea of stewarding that in perpetuity and actually making that work for the community. So keeping that idea of perpetual affordability and community benefit live. Restart. So the three aspects of this stewardship are helping people to get into and maintain their housing. So they do a lot of support work. Second is balancing the need of the household with the need of the community or society at large, including future generations and future residents. And the last one is the sort of stewardship or more effective use of any subsidies or donations that have gone into the stock. So they work really hard at making that money sort of stretch for as far as it can, mainly through the restriction of resales and capping of rents and so forth. But what I want to drop, curious, interesting thing. What I want to drill down on is this idea of balancing household need with community or societal need. So what they really do is unpack the bundle of rights that are tied up in property. So earlier when we're talking about property, we're talking about how it presumes particular things. What the CLTs do is really unpack those and start thinking about, well, who should have what rights and responsibilities, and how do you keep that dynamic and active? So for example, where they've got a resale formula, they aim to balance the equity gain to the owner with the retention of affordability for the next buyer. So they're keeping this sort of dialogue going between the multiple people who are affected by this property arrangement. So the resale formula can be indexed to AMI, CPI, it can be itemised, or it can be a percentage of the agreed value gain. Again, that depends on who they're trying to house and what they're trying to achieve. In perpetuity. Okay, so the conditions regarding repairs and maintenance also aim to balance the rights of the residents to improve their property and their right to provide enjoyment with the maintenance of affordability. So when they've got an ownership situation, they want people to have that ownership, have that sense of autonomy, but not be able to sort of marble clad everything and price out the subsequent resident. So in order to do all of this, they generally have board structures that aim for balance between multiple stakeholders and have community representation. So the sort of classic board structure of CLT is a third the residents who live in the organisation's home, a third general members of the organisation who don't live in its homes but support its mission, and then a third of professional and independent representatives who are actually elected by the other 2/3. So they're a sort of deeply democratic structure aiming to balance those voices, but also bring them into dialogue around what community benefit and affordability are and what they need to be on an ongoing basis. So we'll have a bit of a look at how these are currently manifesting. So in the USA, there's over 250 CLTs providing this mix of tenures. They've got close to 60,000 housing units now in the network membership, and that's rentals, co-ops, home ownership, and lease purchase models. So they're doing pretty much everything that you can do on land. We're starting to see some really big interventions coming up. So in 2017, there was a 1.65 million pilot, which was specifically in New York to support the establishment of CLTs, and starting to see these hybrid and kind of networked models emerging to get to scale and to start getting some kind of significant interventions in overpriced housing markets. And the interesting thing is that increasingly there are municipal governments who are realising that they need to be supporting this and taking land out of the market if they actually want to see deep affordability in their jurisdictions. So I think that gives a really solid platform in those situations for some of the models we're hearing about, where you can then have a base for doing the deliberative development and getting really deep affordability outcomes at the same time. So the Interborough funding was part of 3.5 million that was provided across 4 counties. And you've got these entities, including players like Habitat for Humanity, becoming involved. So we're seeing these sort of, these networked coalitions emerging. So this is the map of CLTs. They're now, I think, every state in the USA, from a sort of slow build over the past, where are we now, 5-6 decades. So looking at an example of one, Champlain up in Burlington, Vermont, a member-based organisation with over 4,000 voting members, and so far responsible for over 2,000 units of housing through 3 counties. Most of that is affordable rental, but they also do home ownership and cooperative housing. Their board includes residents, non-resident members, and representatives of the public at large. They've got their classic 3-part structure, and they do everything from low density in the suburbs and rural areas through to multi-unit medium density in downtown Burlington. So they're right across those counties. But boarding houses, low income rentals, cooperative housing, owner occupied, plus commercial and community facilities and enterprises. They've been going now for, it'd have to be over 30 years. So it's an example of some of their stock. So it's a co-op up the top there, where the CLT owns the land and the co-op owns the homes. We can't do that split here in Australia, so we tend to talk about other ways of splitting up the property, but it doesn't really matter if you split it horizontally, vertically, what have you. It's really just about the articulation of that perpetual relationship between whether it's an individual or a co-op and the CLT. Bottom left is freestanding owner-occupied home, and then Vermont Legal Aid is an example of one of those non-for-profit entities set up on CLT land. You can see they do a raft of social and community spaces. So there's a bike repair and servicing facility, which is under in the basement of a garage upstairs, which is the same thing for cars, with a food shelf, and a whole bunch of mixed-use spaces that are all on CLT land. So jumping across the Atlantic, Learning from the US, this is a reasonably recent state of play in the UK, where you can see CLTs popping up everywhere. It's been fantastic watching their map get updated because it's been a really rapid growth, sort of piggybacking on the experience of the US. And you can see they're both in urban and rural regions, which is really encouraging because initially it's primarily rural. So looking at an example there, looking at the East London CLT St Clement's site. And again, what we're increasingly seeing is these partnerships between government and the CLT, and as with both the models Cameron and Tim were talking about, where developers are starting to partner as well. So this was an agreement between the Greater London Authority, Galliford Try, who are a developer, and the East London CLT. So the whole site's going to be transferred to a new foundation. And Galliford Try will operate the market rate development via a long-term lease. The perpetually affordable homes built on the site will be owned by the CLT, and the homes will be available to local people with prices determined by local income. So I've managed to get extraordinarily deep affordability in London. The houses are going for, I think, less than half the rate of the open market, which is a remarkable outcome. They had a lot of design charrettes, both before the site was secured and on an ongoing basis. And that those design workshop findings and objectives have been incorporated into the design. The buildings were opened for interim uses as soon as possible, and that helped to activate the site while it was being developed. The first 23 homes had over 700 applicants, so incredibly oversubscribed. There's definitely a market for these products. So I think the point earlier that Karen was saying about how developers are really wedged if they don't have an identified market, and really see the strength of the potential market once people know what's available and can actually engage in a development process and know there's some deep affordability possibly coming down the pipeline. So this is, this was pre-development. You can actually go online now and it looks a lot judgier if you go online, because they're actually now complete and sold and they've got the prices up. So it's really exciting to go and see the sort of before and after shots of the development, and they're now moving on to the next development. So going north, and then we'll jump to possibilities here. Now, the interesting thing about the CLTs in Scotland is that they were really fundamentally enabled by legislated community rights. So part of the whole Scottish independence movement has been this incredible focus on legislation around the community right to buy land, particularly where there are landlords who are absentee and communities who can't actually get access to their traditional lands. So the Land Reform Act of 2003 actually gave crofting communities the right to acquire and control croft land where they live and work. So this is sort of farming, traditional farming communities actually being able to give the right to acquire that land. It also gave other communities the first the first offer to buy identified parcels of land as they came to market. So this was actually a massive intervention. All the sort of absentee lords from South England all threw their hands up in the air because it really fundamentally kind of challenged their absentee ownership from south of the border. And so consequent acts have furthered the scope and strength of community buyout rights, and it's been really strongly tied to the independence movement. As I said, so you can go online and look at this. Go and look at Community Land Scotland. It's quite remarkable the extent of the buyouts. So as an example, the Isle of Egg. Off the Scottish coast. They bought the island through £1.5 million raised amongst residents and also from supporters further afield. It was owned by an absentee landlord. Now it's a heritage trust that they set up, owns it, and established 3 subsidiary companies with different functions. So they've got a renewable energy company. They've got ownership of the shop, the post office, tea room and craft shop. So we're seeing this return of community assets into community hands. And they've also set up a construction company to renovate homes and doing repairs and small infrastructure projects. So we're seeing this whole sort of ecosystem of community-based development coming from that land base, but it's all sort of operating outside of the speculative market. And the really cute thing, Egg Roll, is their shared equity scheme. So they've actually got a rolling shared equity scheme with no land cost. And there's a condition in there that if they sell the land value, if there's a land value in the sale price, that will go back into the trust. So there's some typically Scottish cows with their wind turbines that are owned by Egg Electric. So here in Australia, what we are seeing is interest amongst CHPs, community groups, government, private and the private sector. And we're also seeing interest amongst Aboriginal organisations and communities because of the resonance of the idea of the stewardship of land. We're seeing really diverse imperatives in play in the system. And I know the other night there was sort of a discussion around how do we stop innovative models from becoming kind of weird and getting sort of annexed by speculative models. And we are seeing some sort of strange articulations of things. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out here. But that said, what we've seen internationally is that hybridity, diversity, flexibility, and opportunism are all required. So you've got to be open to take advantage of the situation that you're in and find you're grabbing things as they become available. What we've seen internationally is that all sectors are involved in some way. So there is no singular model here. It's really about just that. How do we get things into a decommodified system to provide permanent affordability and community benefit? So we really need sort of nuanced and intelligent discussion and commitment to provision, which I think some of the models tonight are really starting to show. And I suspect that we are right on the cusp of this starting to emerge. And what we saw for a long time was after the GFC, the fact that our mortgage hadn't crashed had actually hindered the conversation and the progress, but it's, there's a live question as to whether COVID has shaken things up a bit and allowed us to think a bit more deeply about how we're going towards things. We are seeing a trend towards the profit-based sharing platforms, but I think, again, the persistence of unaffordability is seeing a bit of a swing back towards thinking about ideas of decommodification. So the question really, I think, is where to from here for the Australian sector as we see these things expand. But I will sign off.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks to all our presenters. And thanks everyone who's been putting in questions throughout the last little bit. So we'll try and cover those as well as some other questions now. We've got about 20 minutes. So I might use my facilitator rights to firstly answer. There was a question in the chat from Maya, I think, about co-ops law and what's changed there. So just quickly, Queensland adopted the national legislation that the rest of the states and territories had adopted. Before that, it caused a number of issues if you wanted to have members in multiple states and some other things before that was done. But now we have a fully harmonised legislation across Australia. So it's just a lot more streamlined if you're looking to use that structure. Also, if you're in Queensland, it means that you have things that other states have had for a while, like cooperative capital units, which is a means for you to potentially have investment from non-members in the co-op and a bit more flexibility even for members investing in the co-op. But happy to chat with you offline more about that. So I might open up with a broad question, which is about culture in Australia. Sometimes in these discussions, people say, but Australians aren't interested in these models. So I guess going around the panel, is that something you think is really a barrier? What are you seeing on the ground? And I might start with Karen in Newcastle.
Anthony, so you're saying, do you think there is a market for more alternative forms of housing?
Or are Australians just inherently not interested in anything other than a detached house in the suburbs?
Listen, I'm not basing my answer on any kind of research.
Sorry, I've made it obvious that I'm asking it in a pretty rhetorical way.
Oh, well, no, but it's interesting. I think what the exposure I have had to anything that's new or often just slightly different from the norm in terms of housing is when you're talking about it and you just got slides and it's just ideas, not the common person can't fathom what it is. They can't connect with the idea of it. It's such a, no matter how simplified you make a proposal for an alternative, it's just so difficult for an everyday person to consider it as an option for themselves. But as soon as it's built and it's real, and they see the people in it, and they see how that thing and how it's different can enhance their life, or it could suit them. I think we've seen that from Property Collective's work, from Tim's projects. You've seen it from the Nightingale projects as well, and the subscriptions for them. And you've seen it in other projects as well. So I think it isn't necessarily that something alternative is a turn off. I think it's just, you just need the real life example for them to sort of feel it for themselves, and then it takes off.
Tim or Louise or Colin, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, look, from my perspective, I think there's increasing interest. It's hard to disentangle a little bit, whether it's the fact that, I mean, from our perspective, Property Collective is gradually getting more well known, and so more people come to us, or whether people are sort of searching it out and sort of coming to us. So I do feel like there is growing awareness and interest in all sorts of alternative models as, you know, the market becomes just harder and harder to access. So I'm definitely seeing that. I think, to Karen's point though, you know, there is a big difference in people being interested in alternative models and actually sort of committing to it. And you know, that, and I think having a building that you can point to that sort of is a manifestation of a model or an approach, you know, clearly helps that, because it just gives people confidence to, you know, move that interest into, you know, more concrete, you know, commitment, you know, and that's going to be the tipping point, I think, for alternative models, is to see that sort of, you know, commitment become, you know, more wider commitment, and a big part of that is the topic of the conversation tonight, is just finance solutions. You know, I think there's, you know, the difference between the thing that will stop people moving from interest to commitment is the financial burden of participating in an alternative model. You know, so for me, a lot of the work we've been doing is trying to reduce that burden, that cash burden, to allow more people to access, you know, more impactful projects, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think with the work that we've done, because we were hearing with the Community Land Trust, because we haven't really got analogous models here in Australia yet, although there are some starting to appear. We were hearing, oh, people won't want to buy into something if they haven't got full ownership rights. Yeah, they're not going to want to buy into something if they can't make that full market rate of gain on their equity. And so we actually went and ran focus groups to see whether that was the case. And so we ran a bunch of focus groups in Melbourne with 25 to 34-year-olds who were in employment, trying to, looking to buy at the moment and unable to do so in the open market, and asked them, would you buy into this? And we undersold it. You know, we went really conservative and made it sound probably more restrictive than a model would really be. But it was over 95% of the attendees would have signed up there and then if there was something. Like, they were kind of like, what do you mean this is a focus group? Where do I sign? You infuriating academic. Like, it was, and it didn't matter whether we talked about leases or deeds. I was just like, don't care. If I get to, you know, live in this place, call it my own, leave it to my kids, I can put my pictures up, I can have a dog, I can make modifications for my kid, you know, whatever. If I get that, and I think it is partly those push and pull factors, you know, the fact that the rental market is just so unaffordable, unstable, you know, all of those things that we know. So I think there's definitely push factors, but also just that, you know, everything it offered in terms of all of those benefits of ownership, but at a lower rate. It was just inherently attractive to people. And that's been the case that they found internationally as well, like particularly in the US with resale restrictions on CLT properties. It was sort of like, yeah, this is communism sort of thing. And then once they survived the GFC and didn't have the mortgage crash, suddenly there was this like, oh, hang on, how did you do that? How have you guys managed to stay above water? You're housing people almost exclusively on low and moderate incomes, but your mortgage foreclosure rates are like a 30th of that of the open market. How did you do it? And so seeing that got real people in it with real lives and real jobs, and it's not causing the sky to fall, it really reassured a lot of the lenders, a lot of the policymakers that no, these are actually really solid models. So it's that whole sort of ecosystem of the familiarity amongst the lenders, the policymakers, the market, the developers, just getting people to, like you say, sort of proof of concept. You go up, you can poke at the walls, you can poke at the people, it's all okay. And just getting that familiarity and exposure seems to be really key. But I would say there's definitely a latent market here for a greater diversity of products.
Colin, there was, you might want to add to that as well, but there's a few specific questions coming through to you about the co-op model around, and Louise, you might have a view on this as well, around the formula used for when people leave a housing co-op. That's the type that Colin was talking about, or maybe when it's a land trust underlying it, how that is worked out, and also how people buy shares in a co-op. That's a question that's come through.
We haven't finalised the formula for departure. I don't know if Louise has any typical examples for CLTs, but yeah, we haven't finalised a particular formula on that. I think I saw the question in the chat around purchasing shares. Well, people have to have sufficient money to purchase the shares, but noting that this is a shared equity model, so you're not buying the, you're not buying the full value of the house. You're buying a proportion, a share in the whole cooperative, and all of the property that it's owned at a much lower level than the full, if you're just buying a house and land package separately. But as I said, we haven't finalised the details of what our exit or our entry process will be. But Louise may well have much better answer than me.
Yeah, it's very much a sort of horses for horses scenario. Each CLT will determine a resale formula based on its market characteristics. So the market it's operating in, what local prices are, who they're trying to house. And like I said, there's that range of things. You can index them pretty flat to sort of CPI or area median income, or you can itemise, etc. What tends to be the most common model in the US, which is probably the biggest database at the moment to go on, is an agreed percentage of the uplift in value. So they'll get an appraisal done at purchase, an appraisal done at resale, and the seller will get a percentage of that agreed uplift. And it might vary as to whether that value includes the value of land or not, or it's just improvements, but then that can get messy depending on arguments about how much is the land worth compared to the property and all the improvements, all those sorts of things. So it tends to just be that agreed split. So having, and what that means is, say, if at the time of occupancy it's worth 300,000, when you go out it's worth 400, the resale price will just have an agreed percentage, say 25%. So it might go up by 25,000, and that's what the purchase price to the subsequent buyer is. And that other 75, no one ever pays that. That's just locked away. That's imputed value. So it's not that the CLT now goes, hey, our assets are worth more, because they never actually realise the value of the land asset. But it tends to be that mainly for the purposes of administrative simplicity, because too many arguments are being had over itemised formulas, and AMI and CPI tend to be a bit too flat and not give people enough equity when they go to be able to go out into the open market.
So something I was thinking about through some of the discussion was around, it's obviously, and it's been raised in the discussion just now as well, is about the challenge of helping people finance this, where they've got to stump up the cash to come in, and especially to make this accessible to a lot of people, you need to find ways around that to help people get in upfront at the start of developments or to enter a co-op or a housing development. So one thing I was thinking of, I'm not aware of examples. Are there examples of equity or debt crowdfunding that sit alongside the members or owners of the development? So obviously bank finance is important most of the time, but are there examples of that the panelists are aware of?
Well, the model that we use, the Property Collectives joint venture model, is effectively a crowdsourced equity funding platform. The difference is, though, that you're putting in your equity and it's manifesting in ownership of a completed dwelling at the end. There are platforms now for sort of equity crowdfunding into property projects. They are sort of being used more traditionally for speculative projects, where they are going in sort of like probably as a second layer of funding above senior debt, or maybe a senior stretch kind of layer. But I'm not personally aware whether they've sort of been used for alternative development models. There's probably they probably could be. The platforms exist. The challenge there is that to attract that capital through a platform like that, you have to be offering commercial rates of return, and that's probably not analogous with supporting an alternative model. So I think the challenge, that's probably where the challenge lies.
Karen?
I had a great visit to a business that was based in the north of Belgium called Co-Housing Projects, is the name of the business. They are a co-housing projects property development consultancy, and after their 10th project, they set up what you're talking about, Anthony, an investment vehicle for investment into co-housing projects which have a social measurable outcome. So they created, the entity was actually a cooperative in nature. So it's a co-op, and people can invest quite small amounts to up to quite large amounts, and they can be specific about which specific project they want to put their money into, dependent on what social outcome. Belgium has a very different planning system to Australia, so it's not something that's overly replicable here, but in essence, the concept of that has some, potentially some replication ability in Australia.
So there is an example. There you go. There's a question just then to Louise around to elaborate on what you mean by COVID being, a new era for getting some CLTs in Australia.
Yeah, well, I was sort of alluding to, I guess, broader public discourse on the idea or the perception that COVID is making people rethink things, and that we're starting to see local governments and policymakers and communities having been quite deeply shaken by the sort of back-to-back of the bushfires and then COVID, and to be saying, well, we can't keep going about things as we previously have, and starting to look for alternatives in terms of less, I guess, extractive modes of arranging our societies and our economies. And as part of that discussion, we're sort of seeing consideration around diversification of property. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be a quick thing, but it's just, I think in some of the conversations that have been going on in the housing sector and amongst community housing providers, there has been this sort of, I think it's been a bit of a shock and a bit of a questioning as to whether business as usual can continue. And I think people are generally thinking no. And so the idea of trying to explore alternatives is, you know, hopefully able to make use of this moment, unsettling and troubling though it is for so many of us.
I think we're almost out of time, but I'll try and have one more question. And there was a question in the chat about, you know, the differences between co-op and strata. I think it's partly been answered in the chat, and it was clear, I think, from Colin what the end ownership is for Earthworker. It's a form of co-op model and probably the reasons why, and from Louise that CLT can kind of underlie a lot of different models. But I think Karen and Tim, do you have a leaning at the moment? Where do your projects, where do you envision the ownership ending up, or currently for the collectives that have come through, Tim, what is it individual ownership at the end, or is it strata? How does it work, and what do you see for the future?
The model is a strata model, and so everybody has free title at completion, and I think for our model that's feels like the right approach, because people are becoming the developer and the equity's going in with the developer risk, and so they should get a title at the end, you know. I think what's interesting for us is as we sort of move and evolve the model to that sort of 2.0 type of approach, you know, we're working with one community housing provider in particular who's looking to leverage our joint venture structure, that strata structure, but participate to then own a number of dwellings for affordable rental or for social housing, or, you know, so it's quite a flexible structure in that respect, in terms of bringing together partnerships around ownership. But the end users under that structure might be affordable rental, if that makes sense. So.
Newcoh worked for nearly 2.5 years with Common Equity New South Wales. We were really keen on using the housing cooperative structure, and it took us a while to lobby them and to basically say, listen, normally you run your housing cooperatives as a CHP and offer it as social housing, but we were saying, listen, what if we looked at a mixed tenure model with an intentional community and a portion of community housing provided apartments? And we finally got their ear. We worked up the model. We got in front of the board. We got voted a yes. And then there was just a very unfortunate set of circumstances where the CEO was struck with a health issue, and the new person coming in just was, you know, left with a baby and just had to rock it first. So the idea of extending their cooperative housing model into co-housing style projects had been put on the burner, and we kind of haven't been able to pick it up since then. But there's a potential. Potentially Common Equity in Victoria might be able to do the same. There is we understood was there was an imperative from the BCCM to take the housing cooperative model out of the CHP and get it into the rest of the market. So, you know, Newcoh is open for a discussion again if there is any sort of other housing cooperative developers out there. Yeah, not simple. Again, it's a finance solution and the devil's in the detail.
Cool. Look, sorry, I haven't covered everyone's questions exactly in the chat, but thanks to all our panelists. Thanks to NENA again, and to Co-Housing Australia for organising. I really enjoyed the discussion and the presentations, and thanks everyone for attending. Have a good night.
Thanks, Anthony.